Hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar on lifting the lid on intergenerational risk sharing. I'm Leah Evans, I'm an associate partner at EY and also chair of the IFOA's Pensions Board. And I'm really looking forward to hearing today's presentation by Professor Catherine Donnelly of Heriot-Watt University, who's been leading the research programme that we'll be hearing more about today. So Catherine gave another presentation last week, which I understand generated lots of questions and engagement with the audience. So I am hoping that today's session will be the same. The purpose of these sessions is obviously to share the latest thinking, but also to get feedback and challenge from the wider profession. So please do get involved, and I'll explain how you can do that shortly. But firstly, today's topic. So many of us in the profession and the wider industry have been grappling for years with the question of what a fair and well-functioning pension system should look like. Greater understanding of risks involved for sponsors and members in DB schemes means that DB schemes mostly no longer provide active benefit accrual, whereas DC perhaps pushes the risks too far the other way, and their concerns about adequacy and the loss of the benefits of collective investment and other economies of scale that DB did offer. So one of the alternative options considered that is now becoming a reality is CDC. And one of the fundamental aspects of a whole life collective defined contribution CDC scheme, such as the Royal Mail one, is investment risk sharing. But how does investment risk sharing benefit members? And does it favour some groups of members over others? So Catherine will present the results of a simplified model of investment risk sharing. And the high-level lessons learned from this model should be really useful to understand the impact of those various factors on the benefits paid to members. So, for example, how do the projected investment returns versus their actual observed values, evolution of the membership profile, and the frequency of contributions and benefits. Now, the work that we'll be discussing today is part of the ARC Optimising Future Pensions Research Programme. And hopefully you'll all be familiar with the ARC, but in case you aren't, the Actuarial Research Centre is the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries' global network of actuarial researchers, and the ARC seeks to deliver cutting-edge research programs that bridge academic rigor with practitioner needs by working collaboratively with academics, international actuarial bodies, and the end-user community. And the ARC supports actuarial researchers around the world in addressing some of the significant challenges in actuarial science, and then ultimately we as practitioners can benefit from some of that. So a few housekeeping points before we get started. Format of the session today is a presentation followed by Q&A, but please feel free to post questions throughout the session, and Catherine may be able to pick some of those up as we go through. So to ask a question, please use the Q&A box on your screen. That's the only way of asking questions. We can't see or hear you. You can just watch and listen. So just use the Q&A function. And you can also use this if you've got any technical issues, but hopefully you won't. Now, if we don't manage to get through all the questions today, we'll follow up afterwards and then post a consolidated response of questions on the ARC webinar series webpage. And then finally, just to note that this webinar is being recorded and the video will be made available for everyone to view afterwards. And you can also log CBD afterwards for attendees of this event. So I think that is all the housekeeping bits I needed to cover. So I'm pleased to now hand it over to Catherine for the main part of today's session.
Well, thanks very much for the introduction, and thank you to everyone for coming along to listen to what we've been finding out about investment risk sharing in the context of collective defined contribution schemes. So this work what I'm presenting today is basically a stepping stone, because we have a stream of work within this Optimising Future Pension Plans research programme on collective defined contribution schemes. And basically what we wanted to know is, what is investment risk sharing in the context of CDC schemes, and what are the factors affecting it? And so what we find is basically the factors are affecting it are the relationship between the contributions and the benefits. So basically, how far away are the contributions from funding the benefits? And then other things, for example, the prediction of returns and how those change over time. and also the membership profile. Now, in today's talk, I'm only going to focus on one of those things, that's the relationship between the contributions and the benefits. Now, we are looking at basically saying that this has an impact. We are not quantifying the impact of that in a realistic setting. That's for future work. But we're just saying that it has an impact. How much, we don't know. And that, as I said, is for the future research within the research programme. So before we go on to looking at that, so we'll just say a little bit, oops, going to move this on. Here we go. So this is research conducted by myself and Dr. Andres Barakat-Paz at Heriot-Watt University. So Andres has recently completed his PhD under Andrew Kerrins and Torsten Kleinow at Heriot-Watt, and he's lending his expertise to this project. So we're working on collective defined contribution schemes, and we also have a research stream on pooled annuity funds. So as Leah mentioned before, we had a webinar last week on that. So if you want to listen to that again, there's a YouTube link here, or you can find that on the Actuarial Research Centre website. I'm sure a quick web search will allow you to find that. Okay, so let's turn now to collective defined contribution schemes. Okay, so in the UK, this is now coming to pass that we're going to see our first collective defined contribution scheme, and they are controversial. So we are not trying to get involved in this controversy. We're just trying to understand how they work, what's the pros and cons, and what might be suitable for one scheme membership. So you can think of Royal Mail. Obviously, they're the ones there. They're a massive membership, and several things that might make it work well for them might mean that the same scheme structure might not work well for a different membership profile. And we don't have to restrict ourselves to just looking at the Royal Mail as being the scheme, though, because it is this scheme which is going to come to fruition. It is very important, but we don't have to restrict ourselves to just copying that, and we can come up with other ideas. And in many ways, a CDC scheme looks exactly like any other pension scheme. So you have members making contributions, well, members and employers. That goes into a fund to grow the assets. The assets earn investment returns, and benefits are paid out. And I guess the question for the future will be is what will the CDC schemes of the future look like? And I guess, yeah, from what I think, basically we see the current CDC schemes are being designed by pension actuaries who have come from a defined benefit pension actuary background. So we might expect that they'll hold on to many of the good features of defined benefit pension schemes, and they would look different to one, say, a life insurance actuary would create. Now, we are going to look at two very simple schemes today within a very simple setting. And the setting is overly simplistic in terms of realism to real life, but it will allow us to see the impact, the effect of this relationship between the contributions and the benefits, which actually you wouldn't really see if you go to even a slightly more realistic model. And basically what we're looking at is we want each contribution to fund a benefit. And if it doesn't, we'll see that there will be an effect on the investment risk sharing. Now, the setting will be that a member will pay a contribution, and in exchange for that, they'll be told, oh, this is the initial target benefit you've accrued by paying that contribution. But that initial target benefit won't necessarily be what they'll get at retirement. That instead will be adjusted over time in line with things like investment returns to allow for changes in those. And it will also be affected, as we said before, by, for example, predictions of those returns. Now, there is a lot of notation in this this presentation, so I apologize for that, but the headline is basically that the relationship between contributions and benefits affect their investment risk sharing, and that's what we're focusing on today to show you that. Okay, so we're going to start off with a very, very simple lump sum scheme where people join and they pay a lump sum contribution. They'll be in the scheme for a certain fixed length of time, capital T years, and then they'll leave the scheme with a lump sum benefit. So you pay a single lump sum contribution when you join, and you receive a lump sum benefit when you retire, and then you leave the scheme. And nobody dies. We assume throughout this, nobody dies. We're entirely focusing on investment returns and investment risk. Now, we are going to assume an extremely simple economic model. we say that you will predict future returns. You have to make predictions of future returns to value future cash flows, those future benefits. And the notation is that we say I1 will represent the return between time 0 and time 1. I2 will represent the return between between time 1 and time 2, and so on. And these are our constant values. The actual returns are random variables. So we have a corresponding return for each of these predicted ones. So R1 is a random return between time 0 and time 1. And I1 is basically the prediction of what we think that return will be, with that return R1. Now, what's very simple about our model is that when you move from time 0 to time 1, you don't update your predictions of future returns, right? And this is overly simplistic, you could say, and I would agree, but basically it will allow us to see that the relationship between the contribution and benefits has an effect, because you'll see it fairly clearly. Now, in practice, you would update these returns over time. And there'll be two contribution benefit structures we'll look at, and it will seem that there's no investment risk sharing going on because that's within our simple model. But if you update these predictions of returns over time, there will be investment risk sharing, but we don't look at that, we'll just say it. And of course, if you move to time 1, you will see what was the actual investment return earned by the fund between time 0 and time 1. Now, I guess what was partly driving this as well, in terms of seeing that this may be important, is that what should happen if you perfectly predict your investment returns? So should everybody get their initial target benefit if you perfectly predict returns? And we'll see that actually they don't if you don't relate the contributions to the benefits directly. Okay, so as I said, we start off looking at a lump sum benefit scheme, and it's multi-generation. For the purposes of this presentation, we'll just say one person joins every year, no one dies. And the idea is that if you're generation G, so we have these different generations joining, generation G enters at time G, and they pay some single contribution, which we allow that it could vary across generations. They pay a single contribution at the time they join, and they wait in the scheme for T years until the retirement date, and then they get some lump sum benefit at that time. Right, so we have capital B for benefit. The little G up here in brackets is superscript. That's because it's relating to generation G. This person here is representing generation G. And G plus T means that that's a value at time G plus T. Right, so at time G plus T, when they retire, you'll know what you're paying them. But we won't know that amount until time G plus T. So what happens before then? So we'll go back. So they pay their contribution when they join the scheme at time G, and in exchange they're told, this is the benefit that we hope to pay you at retirement, right? And that benefit is this B for benefit, again, the superscript G, and then it's G in brackets here for this is the value that we're telling you at time G, but this value is meant to be paid at their retirement date. Okay, that's their initial target benefit. So the person waits for 1 year and we update their target benefit to some new value, right? So we have their benefit, it will still be paid at the same time, the retirement date, but we're going to update its value. And this is where the investment risk sharing occurs, basically. So to get its value, we take the previous year's value, in this case, BGG, previous target benefit, and then we adjust it by a benefit increase. So this 1 plus, this is a gamma. It's not very clear in this equation editor, but it's 1 plus a gamma calculated at a time G plus 1. And so the calculation of the gamma is where the investment risk sharing comes in. Now I call this gamma a benefit increase rather than a pension increase because it's just a one-off increase. So anybody who's familiar, for example, with the Royal Mail scheme, they do this kind of thing, but it's with pension increases that are intended to be applied every year, rather than this kind of one-off increase what we're doing here. And we're doing a one-off increase because we are just trying to understand the factors driving the investment risk sharing, and it also allows us to basically have an expression that we can say our benefit increase equals something on the right-hand side that doesn't involve the benefit increase. If it was a sort of a true, genuine pension increase, we wouldn't be able to do that. We'd have an implicit equation. So this is because we're in a toy model and we're just looking at the factors driving investment risk sharing rather than trying to quantify the impact of it. So what do we do to calculate this benefit increase? So we take the asset value across the entire scheme at time G+1. So that will include the assets you could attribute to this generation G, i.e. the contributions they made, plus everybody else who's been in the scheme. And we divide by effectively the sum of the discounted benefits, right? So what we do is we look at everybody who was in the scheme the previous time period, so at time G. So that would be the generation G who just entered the scheme at that time, plus generation G-1, G-2, and so on. So everybody who's in the scheme at time G and will stay in the scheme until time G+1. We take the target benefits they were told at time G, right? So for generation G, it would be the BGG. And we discount that back to time G+1. And that will be the discounted benefit in the denominator here. And we sum that over all of the generations in the scheme at time G. Right, so this is the investment risk sharing aspect. Now, some things we'll, I guess, discuss, but just discuss rather than we won't show any formula. So, for example, we'll see that if you update your predictions of the returns over time, so I1, I2, and so on, if we update those, then this discount factor will reflect our new predictions of investment returns from time G+1 onward. And that will impact the investment risk sharing. But since we're not updating it over time, that will not affect the investment risk sharing within the simple model. So in the investment risk sharing, we also see that basically we're giving everybody the same benefit increase. So the scheme composition matters. So who's in the scheme, how many people are in the scheme, how many years they have to retirement, what benefit they've accrued. That will impact this benefit increase because that's affecting here the discounted benefits. And of course, it's affecting the asset value because that will affect the contributions going into the asset value. So the membership profile will, of course, have an effect on that. Now, but let's look at it within our simple economic setting to begin with, these benefit increases. So, if returns are perfectly predicted, you might think that the benefit increase equals 0, right? So if you perfectly predict your returns, you might think it should be 0, but we're going to see that it's not necessarily the case. So the first thing we're going to have to look at is this contribution benefit relationship. So we're going to look at 3 possible ways of doing it. So at time G, you pay your single contribution in exchange for this initial target benefit, which will be paid in capital T years time, right? The time until your retirement. And so how are we going to relate them? So our 3 ways we'll outline those. So the first way is that we fix the initial target benefit for everybody in the scheme. Right, so whenever they join, you're told your initial target benefit is 100, right? You can choose anything you like, we'll just choose 100. And then the contribution paid by each generation, we take that 100 and we discount it back to the time of payment when we make the contribution. And because the predicted investment returns can be different, they're different for potentially for each generation will pay different contributions, right? But basically the key thing here is that your contribution is intended to fund the benefit, right? So if you accumulate your contribution over using these predicted returns, you should get to 100. The other way is we just fix our contribution and we set the initial target benefit to be the predicted accumulation of that contribution, right? So that means everybody pays the same contribution when they join, but their initial target benefit will vary because they're all facing potentially different predicted returns here. And then the third way we're going to look at is when we fix the target benefit, the initial target benefit for everyone, and we fix the contributions, right? And in this case, we don't have in general a relationship between the initial target benefit and the contributions. So then the question is, how do we choose the C? Well, you can choose anything you like for this constant C. Whenever we're fixing the contributions, what to choose. So we're just going to choose that by reference to the first generation to join, who join at time 0. And for them, we're going to say, we'd like to pay you £100 at retirement. So we'll discount £100 back using the predicted returns that you will face. And we're going to use that for everybody. You can choose different things if you like, but this is just the simple way of doing it. Okay, so let's look at the, I've got a bar, menu bar in the way. So the first benefit increase. So generation 0 joins at time 0. They pay their contribution and they're told this is your initial target benefit, whatever it is. It'll either be 100 or it'll be the accumulation of their contribution according to what structure we're using. So they stay in the scheme from time 0 to time 1, and at time 1 we calculate the first benefit increase using that formula. We take the asset value and divide by the value of the discounted benefits, and it's very straightforward with this first benefit increase. Generation 0 is alone in the scheme, and we can calculate the first benefit increase is this very simple looking ratio. It's effectively the ratio of the actual return achieved by the assets by what we predicted that return to be. So you can see, for example, that if actual returns were equal to your predicted return, that your benefit increase would be 0. But even if that were not the case, basically what we'll see is that effectively it's like generation 0 is in a defined contribution scheme. There isn't any investment risk sharing going on. They're effectively getting a return on their, you can think of their contributions are effectively just being accumulated with the actual investment return. And it turns out that for the other two structures, exactly the same thing happens, right? So it's just like generation 0 is on their own, which they are between time 0 and time 1. Now, let's look now at the second benefit increase. So at time 1, generation 0 got their first benefit increase, and then immediately after that, we allow generation 1 to join. They pay their contribution, whatever that is, and then generation 0 and generation 1 are in the scheme until time 2, at which time we calculate our next benefit increase. So with the two structures in which the contributions directly fund the benefits for each generation, then we find that we have a very similar formula to the first benefit increase, and that it looks like this. So it's just the second benefit increase is effectively the actual return experienced between time 1 and time 2 divided by the prediction of that return. And that happens for when you fix the contributions and allow the initial target benefit to be the accumulation of those fixed contributions, or you fix the target benefit and allow the contribution to be the discounted value of that fixed benefit. But if you fix the benefit and fix the contribution, we get, well, a much messier looking formula for the benefit increase. So we get the 1 plus R2 divided by 1 plus I2, but then we get this other term right here, which doesn't look as nice. And basically, what will happen is that even if returns turn out to be as expected, so I1 equals R1, I2 equals R2, then this second benefit increase will not be 0, right? Even if everything turns out to be as expected. It would only be 0 if additionally, on top of that, on top of perfectly predicting investment returns, we also had constant interest rates, right? So if I1 and IT plus 1 are constant, then, and we also perfectly predicted returns, then the gamma 2 would be 0. But in general, it won't be. And we can even see, if I don't know, it's a lot of algebra to be putting on top of everybody immediately, but if you allow generation 1 to retire at time 2, as soon as they got the second benefit increase, you had your time until retirement was 2 years, then you would see that actually generation 0 and 1, they both get gamma 2 as their benefit increase at this time. Generation 0 would retire with a benefit that was in general not equal to 100, even if you perfectly predicted returns, because of this. It's basically because of a lack of symmetry between the in the investment risk sharing equation, in the calculation of the benefit increase, between the accumulation of the asset value and the discounted benefits. And that's entirely due to the lack of linkage between the benefits and the contributions. Even though for the first generation they're paying a kind of fair contribution for their benefit, because you're giving them a target benefit of 100 and you're getting them to pay a contribution which is the discounted value of 100. But because generation 1 is not paying the fair value for their benefit of 100, you get this lack of symmetry, and you get this messy looking term here. But this is just saying what I was saying here. So if you perfectly predict returns, then the schemes where your contributions fund your benefits, you're basically on track to give everybody their initial target benefit as their benefit paid at retirement, but not so for the scheme where you break the linkage between the benefits and the contributions. Yeah, so this is basically just saying that. So you don't get your initial target benefit at retirement if returns are perfectly predicted and you break that linkage. So we can see this very simple, within this very simple setup, a graph of this just to reinforce that. So we're going to assume that returns are, the actual returns experienced are as predicted. We're within this very simple lump sum scheme. We'll assume you've got 10 years from when you join to when you retire. We'll assume that we'll set the initial target benefit to be 100, and we calculate a contribution, fixed contribution, to be £94.67. So how is this calculated? Well, we're assuming an economic scenario where we think returns will be 0.1% in the first year, 0.2% in the second year, 0.3% in the third year, and so on. We can't assume constant returns because then these three structures just collapse down to being exactly the same. So we can't see this difference then. And we're calculating this contribution as a contribution that's the one for generation 0. So we discount £100 back from time 10 to time 0 using the 0.1%, 0.2%, and so on faced by generation 0, the first generation to join. But we get everybody to pay this fixed contribution, and we tell everybody this is their target benefit. And we can also compare this, the benefit you would get under this very simple CDC scheme with that which you would get under the individual defined contribution scheme, where we just take your contribution and we accumulate it with investment returns, right? And we're assuming here the actual returns are the predicted returns. Okay, so we have one new member joining each year for 60 years. And on this graph, we're showing the benefit paid at retirement. So after you've been in the scheme for 10 years, having made your contribution, the actual benefit at retirement paid to each generation. Now, just say quickly that these things are all shown as lines. They should really be points, because we don't get half generations. They're just integer numbers, but it's just because it's visually easier to see lines rather than dots. Okay, so we have here generation from 0 to 60. This dashed line is the initial target benefit that we're telling people that they're going to get. The dashed dotted line is what they would get if they invested their contribution to get the actual experienced investment returns, right? So which are increasing each year by 0.1%, from 0.1% up to 7%. And then the black line is what you get, what each generation gets in the collective defined contribution scheme, right? So we see, for example, generation 0. So if they took their £94.67 and they invested it as an individual defined contribution scheme, then 10 years later, they would get £100, right? So we were assuming actual returns equals predicted returns. But in the collective defined contribution scheme, they actually get more because of this investment risk sharing mechanism being affected by the contributions not funding the benefits for everybody past generation 0. So generation 0, they paid their fair contribution, one could say, but nobody else did. And they get more consequently. Then in some sense, the scheme has paid out too much money. And so the next generation, they get more than under an individual defined contribution, but just not quite as much, relatively quite as much as the first generation did. And this continues on and on and on. So basically, in some sense, the scheme has paid out too much. So it's kind of like a loss in the scheme, though it's gain for those generations. And basically, we see that this, under the collective defined contribution, because in this sense, you paid out too much at the beginning, that has to be accounted for somehow, that the last generations, they get less money. So at this point, this line switches down because this is a point at which people stop joining the scheme. And this is at time 60. So this generation 50 who retire at time 60. And at this point, nobody else is joining the scheme, and the scheme is in a kind of wind down situation. Now, this is not, don't take this as quantifying the impact of all of this. This is not a realistic setting whatsoever. We're just saying there is an impact, and we don't know what it is in a realistic setting, but we're just saying there is an impact of this contribution benefit structure. Okay, so that's just a summary of what we were saying there. So it all goes back to this formula here. The results we show also depend on the fact that we have this very simple setting. So it looks, for example, if you sort of follow through all the calculations, oh, sorry, before I go on here, I'll just go back here a wee second. I should say that if you had the other two schemes, if you looked at this graph, the other two schemes where the contributions directly fund the benefits, then this black line would just follow the dashed dotted line in that case, right? So it would just be as if you're in an individual defined contribution scheme. It is not correct to say, therefore, there is no investment risk sharing. That's entirely due to our simple economic setting, where we assume you don't update your predictions of returns over time. Because those schemes within this current economic scenario where you don't update your predictions, we have this nice symmetry between the accumulation of the asset value and the discounting factor here. Once you say, oh, I'm going to update my predictions over time more realistically, then this discount factor will lose its sort of linkage or symmetry with the accumulation of the asset value. And that will bring in an investment risk sharing due to changes in your predictions of return over time. And that's something else to look at. But if you do that immediately, you looked at that economic scenario immediately where you do updating, it's very hard to see the relationship, the impact of this contribution benefit relationship, in that it just gets all merged into one fraction and you can't see really what's going on there. So we're just trying to understand these factors and, if possible, isolate them. Right, so that was a very simple lump sum scheme, and now we're going to look at an annuity benefit scheme. And in many ways, effectively an annuity benefit scheme, the way we're going to look at it, it will look, basically it's just a series of lump sum payments effectively. It's not going to be exactly the same, because each contribution here in the annuity scheme will fund not just a single lump sum benefit, but it will fund an annuity. And in this case, in this scenario, it's a fixed term annuity because we're assuming nobody dies. But it's basically the same thing we'll carry across. And we don't even have to do many calculations to see that. So we do some just to illustrate it. So in this annuity benefit scheme, the idea is that you pay a series of contributions while you're in the scheme, right? So we say you're in the scheme for capital T years pre-retirement, and you pay contributions at the start of each year. So if you're Generation G, you pay C for contribution, the superscript here, G, for this is your generation, and then the G in the bigger brackets here is the time at which you made the payment. Then you retire capital T years after you join, and you receive an annuity for S years, some fixed time S years. So again, the question, how should contributions relate to the benefits? And here, the way this investment risk sharing works, that we are doing this investment risk sharing every year. We're not looking back over someone's lifetime and doing it. So it seems more natural that each contribution should directly fund some of this, some of the benefits paid in retirement, right? So we're not looking at seeing if the entire discounted value of the contributions equals the entire discounted value of the benefits. We're ruling this forward as we go in time. We want each contribution to fund each of the benefits. That's what we're going to look at mostly. So we'll look at the first contribution that paid. So your Generation G, you enter at time G, you pay some contribution. And that contribution is going to fund a payment, a little annuity, starting from your retirement time and continuing for a fixed time S. And we'll say that overall, we'd like, when you finish paying all your contributions, we'd like that you had a benefit of £100 per annum. So what we'd like is that contribution fund some fraction of that 100. And the fraction that it will fund is, we'll just set as this alpha GG. So the alpha is the accrual fraction. The G says it's relating to, the superscript G says it's relating to Generation G. And this bigger G is the time at which you made this contribution and the time at which we accrued this fraction. And we're assuming the same fraction for each contribution. across each contribution. I'm probably going to say this wrong, but anyway, so that's our first contribution. And then we move across to time G+1, we make another contribution, and it will fund potentially another fraction of our benefits, right? And we move up as we continue along. Generation G continues to pay contributions, and they continue to accrue some fraction of this £100 per annum that we'd like them to have at retirement. Okay, so this is basically summarizing the overall picture. So Generation G has paid all their contributions, and they've got all these accrued fractions of the 100. So we'd like the sum of the accrued fractions to be 1, so that they'll have £100 at retirement. So the question is how to choose these individual fractions. So there are two main ways of doing this, so based on what we could see in practice. So the first one is based on what we typically see in a defined benefit pension scheme, just applied within our sort of simple setting here, where we're just dealing in constant values. So the first one is to have a constant benefit accrual. So we say we're making capital T contributions. So we'll assume that each contribution is funding 1/T of the target benefit, right? So if capital T was 40, we paid 40 contributions, we would accrue 2.5% of our target benefit each year by our contribution. If you do this and you say my contribution should equal the discounted value of the benefit it directly accrues, then that applies that your contributions are compound. And you can calculate this relationship between your contributions. So your contribution paid at time K will be your previous one, paid at time K minus 1 times 1 plus your predicted return, right? So if we have, basically the message is, if we have constant benefit accrual, this will end up giving us contributions which increase over time if you assume your predicted returns are increasing. And effectively, this is age-related contributions. So constant benefit accrual gives age-related contributions, which makes sense, right? Because the further you are from retirement, well, you're trying to accrue the same in our setting. You want to accrue the same cash flow paid in retirement with each contribution. And as you move closer to retirement, you've got less time for investment returns to be earned on your contribution to fund those the same constant cash flows to be paid in retirement. So contributions then should go up over time. The other one is compound benefit accrual, right? So you basically have that you will have the highest benefit accrued when you're younger, and it will decrease over time in line with your predicted returns. And again, if you make this assumption and you then say, I want each contribution to fund this compound benefit accrual structure, then you find out that contributions are constant, right? That's a consequence of this compound benefit accrual. So the contributions paid by Generation G are constant for Generation G. The next generation will potentially pay a different contribution, but it will be constant for them. So if we have this benefit accrual, which is highest for the youngest people in the scheme, people furthest from retirement, then that will decrease over time, but we'll be paying constant contributions, right? Which again makes sense, because if you're far from retirement, you're paying a constant contribution, then you're far from retirement, there's more time for that contribution to grow and therefore effectively give you a bigger benefit. So we can say compound benefit accrual or age-related benefit accrual gives constant contributions. Now, I'd also say this is all within our model, that we can have these kind of nice equations. Now, in practice, again, you update things over time, that we cannot set one of these. Oops, dear. We couldn't fix this relationship between the accrual fractions, for example, or between the contributions and say that's it for all time. It would change over time. But I guess the message is really within this, within a collective defined contribution scheme, you probably want to give some certainty to people about what their benefits are and what their contributions are. But that has an impact on the investment risk sharing, right? And just to be aware, there is an impact. The further you go from the contributions funding the benefits, it's likely the more impact that will be, there will be in the benefits paid out. And I guess it's just to be aware of that, and because it does become quite hidden once you move to a more realistic model. But we just say it is there, and we will try and see if we can somehow quantify it. Anyway, so we have these two structures, and we can look at what they would look like in an even simpler setting. So we'll just assume a constant return here, constant interest rate. We could say constant return or constant interest rate. Probably should have said return. So we'll just say, let's assume all our predicted interest rates are 2.5%. What would these look like? So with the compound accrual percentage, we have this table. So we have years in the scheme, so year 0, and we give figures for assuming that you've just made your first contribution in the scheme in this column. So if you want to accrue £100 per annum target benefit, you pay £23.10. And that will accrue you 3.9% of your benefit. 5 years later, you've just made your 6th contribution. Because your accrual percentage is going down over time with this, it's going down by 2.5%. You pay the same constant contribution, £23.10, and you accrue 3.4%. But in total, you've accrued about 22% of your benefit, right? So you've accrued quite a big whack of your benefit, which might be useful in terms of younger people seeing the benefit of saving in their pension scheme. Okay, and then we can look at the constant accrual idea. So your 40 years of contributions, so you accrue every year with your contribution, you accrue 2.5% of your benefit. The first contribution you pay is £14.90, and that will increase in each year by 2.5%. So for example, just after you've made your 6th contribution, that 6th contribution is £16.80, which is funding another 2.5% of your benefit, and you've accrued in total 15% of your benefit. Now, if we look at the situation where we fix the contribution and we fix the accrual percentage, right? So now, within, again, our simple setting, you could simply pay a constant contribution to accrue a constant accrual percentage. And at the end, you would have paid enough to fund your benefit in isolation, let's say. You would be told, for example, so you'd be told you paid £23.10 as your first contribution, and you're told that that is your amount of benefit you've accrued. Now, if you think back to our investment risk sharing formula, the benefit increase, so you'd be updating the benefits accrued using the investment risk sharing formula from year to year as we go along. So we'd have basically the assets would be increasing by this contribution amount, but whenever we're doing dividing the asset by the discounted value of the benefits, the benefits valued would be this 2.5%, when really the true value of your contribution should be 3.9%. So this, again, you can see from that, just saying that if you have a look at it, it will also affect your investment risk sharing formula, that the benefit increase is granted to people. So yeah, so basically that will be another effect. So we will be looking at that later on. So, and effectively, of course, this has been brought up before. If you do this constant contribution, constant benefit, there will be a gain or loss upon entry to the scheme, depending on when you join the scheme, and also upon exit, depending on when you exit the scheme, if you exit pre-retirement. But this is just to say this will affect the investment risk sharing, but we haven't quantified the impact of that. So yeah, in conclusion, this has an impact. It's hard to see whenever you move to more difficult, more realistic models. It just, everything becomes more mixed up, basically. But as I said shortly a little while ago, it's hard to avoid doing this, right? Because realistically, you're not going to have a scheme where you have all your benefits perfectly funded by your contributions. That you will have to have some trade-off. So it's more just be aware that there is a trade-off, and I guess look at it and see how much effect does it have. I also think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact, we're looking at one little aspect of collective defined contribution schemes, And we should also look at what else would people do if they weren't in the collective defined contribution scheme. So we want to build such schemes that are useful, that are going to be delivering people what they want. But we also have to see, before we get too critical of them, what else would people be doing if they weren't in such a scheme? And I think that's maybe something that's sometimes missed. So that is the conclusion of my talk. So I'm more than happy to hear any questions you may have.
Great. Well, firstly, Catherine, thank you very much for a really interesting session. Lots to give people something to think about there. And as a reminder, please do send in questions via the Q&A function. And certainly, I thought it was very interesting, and really appreciated the way you took us step by step through the formulae, so they didn't seem quite as imposing once you talked us through us as they did on the face of it. And I mean, maybe while we wait for some questions to come in, I guess the obvious one is, you said yourself, this is a simplified model, and it's great to be upfront about that, because then that helps us isolate some of the decisions and how they interact. But clearly in practice there will be extra considerations, and I suppose the most obvious one is the mortality one, as well as leavers and things like that. Do you have any sense for how some of your conclusions might change once you allow for mortality as well, or is it sort of just a question of it makes the modelling more complicated, and the actual impact will depend a bit on actual investment returns?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I guess it's more, so for me, I think well, as long as you're not worried about leaving money to your heirs, your dependents, basically it seems crazy not to do any longevity risk pulling. That's just, to me, it's just a no-brainer really. And that's what the previous webinar we talked about. But I think that the investment risk sharing is more contentious, and I think rightly so, it's more contentious. I mean, it basically is a question of, if things go wrong, then you pay out too much money to some generations, and then the later ones pay for it effectively, and that's really what's going to happen. I guess it's a case of what we still have to figure out is basically how bad can it be, but also what are the benefits of it, because it is a lot of comfort to people to have more certainty about what they're getting. You could say maybe it's an illusion of certainty, but it is better for them if they can have a better idea of what they're going to have at retirement, and they can understand what they're going to have. For example, think at the moment with our nearly everybody's in the DC pension provision, being told, oh, you've got this big lump sum of money, and hidden away somewhere in the back is, oh, this would convert to a pension of whatever, some small number. I don't think people really pay attention to that. Plus, it's no focus on how that income will change over time. The entire focus is on investment returns, and it's very hard to gauge for anybody by looking at a lump sum. What does that mean for me in terms of an income retirement? So, a big benefit in terms of expressing things as an income to people is allows them to get a better idea of what they'll get in retirement as an income. And I think we lose all of that with this with DC presentation. Whether you can say, well, it's just an issue of changing the communication, that's something else. but yeah, I think this, expressing things as an income, the collective nature of CDCs, definitely in terms of longevity risk pulling, I think that would be crazy not to. How investment risk sharing is done, and therefore who may be the winners, who may be the losers, that to me is a trade-off between what are the benefits to everybody in terms of more knowledge about what they're going to get and planning for retirement, because I think those actually matter a lot more, but they're not necessarily something quantifiable financially.
Yeah, and I mean, linked to this, in the simplified scenario you showed, it was fairly easy to say who the winners and losers are because of the assumptions that you've made over future investment returns. And clearly in practice, those will go up and down and be more random, and there'll be different winners and losers. So we've had a couple of questions about, how do you communicate those those risks to members compared to traditional established pension arrangements? And, or, are we expecting members to understand how these risks work and the cross subsidies, and how do we sort of assess fairness in a way that members would understand?
So, well, I think there's some clever things we should learn as well from, for example, the Royal Mail setup, and this is to do with how people perceive things. So we know from behavioral psychology that people do not like losses. So if you say present benefits as we've done here, we just say you've got a benefit and you get a benefit increase up or down, that is that makes people much more aware of losses. Again, whether you say that's a good thing or a bad thing is another question, but basically how you present things matters. So if you say to someone, I'm going to give you £100 pension, but it may go up or down, or you tell someone, I'm going to give you £60 pension plus pension increases, even though the £60 plus pension increases equals £100 at the present time, but they'll be much less aware of losses in the value of the pension, and because of the way it is expressed, because they'll lock on to, oh, I'm getting £60 plus this vague thing called pension increases, versus you tell them I'm going to give you £100, and then you really do just have to expose them to the brutality of gains or losses. But again, you can say, well, that's just a trickery, but then what else would they be doing with their money, or would they save as much? And you can look at DB pension schemes and see, well, employers closed them down and open DCs made a lot lower contributions, and people probably just made the minimum contributions to their DC. Everybody just goes into the default fund. Is that in everybody's best interests or individuals' best interests? So we also have to look at all those aspects as well.
Yeah, no, that's very true. One sort of more technical question here: is the investment risk sharing mainly arising during accumulation, or to some extent during decumulation as well?
So it will it's really across all of time. So yeah, it's quite complicated. So the asset value will represent obviously past returns, but it also represents, within the asset value, are your previous predictions of future returns as well, because contributions will depend on that to some extent, whether strongly or not. But the money you pay out will also depend on what you thought beforehand what future returns will be. So it's all sort of mixed up within the asset value. If you look at other studies of CDC schemes in terms of the risk, so the other studies tend to be, let's say, a more restricted setting, but basically the earlier generations, well, basically the people in the middle tend to have the best situation when you've got a big stable scheme. And the people at the start tend to have something that's can be more risky, can be less risky. Again, it depends what happens. And the people at the end, though, bear most of the volatility around previous predictions of returns being different to what you thought they were going to be. But again, the extent of that in a more realistic setting, to quantify that and then to consider, is that worthwhile given what else people could be doing, will be doing if you don't offer such schemes? And that's, well, we're not going to be able to quantify that part of it, but we haven't looked at that quantification within a more realistic setting yet.
And I mean, you were just talking about scale. One question here is, how big a pool in terms of members do you expect to need to operate this in practice? So I guess, what does scale and stable look like?
Yeah, so we've also, I didn't show here, so it's more, I guess, the relative number of members. So basically for example, the growth in the membership profile matters. So we just showed you a little chart there with one person joining every year. So you could have one person joining, then 2 people, then 4 people. And in that case, then again, that will have potentially a large impact on this investment risk sharing mechanism. So that definitely does have an impact on it. Precisely what happens depends on, is it growing the membership over time by a lot or growing by less? It depends on the future returns that you think they're going to be, and then the actual returns. There's not really just a single we just can't say this is what will happen. It's really, you have to look at the individual situation.
Okay. And a couple of questions here on the theme of fairness. So one is, how do you provide the fairest CDC scheme? So for example, if you've got age-related accrual rates, do you run into problems with age discrimination? And does that mean you need changes in legislation to make that happen? And then another question on the link on the question in terms of fairness is, if you're also talking about significant employer contributions, does that link into the intergenerational fairness? Like, which generation is the employer subsidizing? Or do you need to make those contributions generational, age related as well?
Well, so on the age related, so you don't have to say it's necessarily age related. It's more like time in the scheme. So if you're and you could then say the same thing applies to DC because you've got more time to accumulate your benefits. So effectively, it's to do with how much time you have to accumulate your benefits between now and retirement. And so you don't have to say, if you're age whatever, this is what you will pay, though effectively that's what it is. And that's effectively what you have in the DC pension scheme. You could say you're contributing a fixed amount, and this is buying you a benefit. And the closer you get to retirement, the less benefit you're buying because you have less time to accumulate returns. So I think that could just be bypassed by expressing it in a certain way, because I don't think it is genuine age discrimination. And the point about employer subsidies, I'm not entirely sure about that. So the idea is that there isn't any additional contributions made in such schemes. It's just the members and the employers pay usually a fixed contribution. I think that's the general idea. Well, you say defined contribution or fixed contribution, and that's it. And there's no additional contributions made in respect of, let's say, notional surpluses or deficits. The idea of the benefit increase is that you always have your assets equal to your discounted value of your benefits once you've applied it.
Okay, but what, as someone has just asked, what happens if you change the assumptions? Is there a risk of things being manipulated to some extent to make it work? Yeah, in terms of setting future assumptions, I guess both on investment returns and demographics. How do you allow for that?
Yeah, well, I guess that's a scheme governance issue. So that becomes back to the actuaries, and that the actuaries are doing things as they should be done. So yeah, we're not going to figure out that in our research. But yeah, I guess that comes back to actuaries doing their job properly.
Okay, and a question here, which I suppose is almost a challenge in a way, but to what extent are we reinventing with profits here? And but more practically, are you looking at previous research and experience from there? Because there clearly is some overlap and probably something that we can benefit from.
Yeah, so you look at the with profits, and not just in the UK, but in other countries. And it's expressed in a different way. So it's expressed in terms of you get a return on your account value, whereas here we're expressing it in terms of this pension increase, so a change to your income. It's not clear how you would directly go between these two structures, because in the with profits, you're effectively saying, I think you could broadly say that you have some actual return, and you also have your prediction of what that return will be, and you credit everybody with some function of the actual return and the predicted return. Within this here collective defined contribution scheme idea, you're effectively giving everybody, you're valuing your benefits as using a kind of weighted average discount factor across the scheme, which will look at predicted returns, not just when you yourself would be in the scheme, but perhaps beyond the time you're in the scheme, because there's younger people than you in the scheme, and that average discount factor will take account of them as well. And yeah, it's just not clear how you would, there's definitely a relationship, but it's not clear how you could say, look, if you do this and that, then it's just a with profit scheme. But of course, you are, at a high level trying to do the same thing. You're effectively, in some sense, spreading an investment return over different generations. But yeah, I haven't seen how. I mean, I've thought about this, but I haven't seen how we could do that, basically.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, we are pretty much out of time. So I just wanted to thank you again, Catherine, for a really interesting and informative session. Thank you to all the participants today for dialing in and for your questions. And just a quick reminder, please do complete feedback survey afterwards. That's really helpful. And also, actually, just a reminder, as I see it on screen, looking for in the midst of planning the conference in 2022, and there are lots of other exciting events coming up on the IFOA, so please do keep an eye on those, and hopefully you'll be able to join us for some of those as well. So thanks, and have a great rest of the day.